I'm not going to lie. Chapter 5 is my favorite chapter in the whole book. That's why I'm teaching an MBA course on it. An entire MBA course just on marketing research. How exciting. But seriously, my interest is in my academic interest is in research, consumer research, and so this chapter is particularly important and special to me. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about why do businesses have to do research? And hopefully in the last 3 chapters, we've covered the idea that a company really needs to understand, the environment in which they are doing business, the customers that they are choosing to target for their marketing activities, and understanding those markets in more detail. So first of all, I hope that the chapters previously have led us up to understanding the need for research. So then we'll talk about the research process. We'll talk about, what does ethics mean in research? And then I'll talk more about the different kinds of research processes. How do we do qualitative research? How do we do quantitative research? And then looking into what's called secondary research, which is research that has already been collected, data that's already been collected, and the use of census information or other collected data that's been that you're repurposing is a form of secondary research. And then we'll highlight specifically how to do primary research. Research is defined as the collection and analysis of data. I think I've mentioned this before, but one of my biggest pet peeves, and I think in the entire industry, is when you're interviewing someone for a marketing position and you say, why did you major in marketing? And they say something like, well, I'm not good in math, but I like business. Or I'm a people person, so I didn't want to do accounting or finance. Both of those answers imply that the person doesn't value the use of data in making decisions. And marketing is no different than any other business function in that all of our decisions have to be based on some sort of factual data, and data that has been either collected for a different purpose or collected for a specific purpose. Either way, we have to understand in marketing how to utilize data to make decisions. We use that information to produce better products and services for our customers, to understand our customers more deeply, communicate better, understand what the right price is, design effective distribution channels. So hopefully I think you should see here the 4 Ps, the product, the pricing, the placing, the promotions, and really making sure that our marketing dollars are spent more wisely by delving deeper into the information that we have about our 4 Ps. This reduces risk to the firm and gives us an estimate of something called ROMI, the return on the marketing investment. So the process is one where you first recognize that you have a marketing problem, you define it, so what problem you're hoping to solve with information, develop your research objectives, design and execute the research, analyze the results, present the results. So data visualization is a very important skill to have. How do you translate numbers or data in terms of a visualization, an infographic, a chart, all of those ways that we communicate data? Then we evaluate the research process itself. Did we do a good job? Did we sample correctly? Do we have unbiased results or representative results? And then we take a marketing decision. That is imperative to understand that the collection of data and even the analyzing of the data is not the end point. The end point is using the data to make a marketing decision. First, let's talk about ethical marketing research. The starting point are either laws or codes of conduct. And I have a link at the bottom we'll take for the US. But ultimately, we need to identify who we are and what the purpose of our research is. if you're an academic like myself, you often have to go through what's called an institutional review board, which approves your research project prior to actually collecting data. When you're a consultant, which is my other side gig, I don't have to necessarily go through an institutional review board to do market research, but ethically, I always identify myself, provide an email, and state the length of time the person will take in completing the survey and what the purpose of the survey is. Research should always be confidential unless the subject's permission is granted and given. And when I'm even in the consulting position, I delete all identifying information such as IP addresses or location or anything that can be identifiable by the respondent. And I also push back sometimes on companies or clients that want to get identifying information such as an email address by asking, what information does that serve? What marketing decision will you make based on this data? If the answer to that question is there is no marketing decision that would be made as a result of collecting this information, then we don't collect it. So a lot of times I don't collect income information, for example, from customers because we don't necessarily use that in our marketing strategies. And and then the final thing is that actually ethical behavior in marketing research also applies to how we store the data and how long we store the data. And so if I publish an article from my code of ethics of my discipline, I actually have to keep the data for 5 years post-publication in case anyone challenges my data analysis or asks to replicate my analyses. So the insightsassociation.org has the Marketing Research Association Code of Ethics. And I would encourage you to research that if the things that we talk about today are things that interest you professionally for your future. So, okay, I think that the text chapter talks about sampling at the end of the chapter, but I'm going to talk about it here. And the reason why is because I want us to start using some terminology, specifically that a statistical population or a statistical sample is different than a country's population, which we've talked about in the previous couple of lectures. So for example, a statistical population might be all men aged from 18 to 25, or everyone who went to the Olympics in 2008, or all bicycles made before 2010. A random sample is simply a subset of the entire population of interest. So it is taking the statistical population and choosing a subset with the same characteristics in the same proportions. So if the statistical population that your company is interested in surveying are men aged 18 to 25, then your random sample should be a random, which means all individuals in the population have an equal chance of being chosen in the same proportions. So you would not here want to over sample the 18 to 21-year-olds just because they're easy to obtain because they're university students and easy to access, when your statistical population is 18 to 25. So you have to think about, how do I reach a representative sample of the entire population of interest? So we often define here the statistical or research population of interest. So again, if we're using our example, men aged 18 to 25, we determine the appropriate sample size. And this differs depending on the kind of research that you're doing. If you're doing political polling and you see results that try to estimate the results of the vote based on a random sample of 100 voters or 1,000 voters in a population of 50,000 voters, that might not necessarily be very representative. So your sample size may have to be larger to make a statistical assumption from. So once we determine the appropriate sample size, we're going to figure out how are we actually going to sample them. And I'll go over that in the next slide. And then we actually have to reach them. So let's talk about sampling methods. So what we want to do is obtain a random sample. And simple randomization means that every person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. That means putting everyone's name into a hat. Again, let's just focus on voters for a moment. And every person in that hat has an equal chance of being chosen. The reality is that is very difficult to do. So think about political polling. That means everybody who is registered to vote goes in a bucket, and those people have an equal chance of being chosen for your polling. Well, we know that that's not the case, that we don't, some of those people won't answer a phone. Some of those people have not reported their phone numbers. Some of those people are not at home when you go knocking on their doors. And so simple randomization is very difficult to achieve. So there are other sampling options. One is called systematic random. This is where respondents are selected at regular intervals from a database. So every 10th name, and the first name is chosen randomly. And then as soon as you get that person's response, you count 10 down in the list and you ask the next person. If that person doesn't answer the phone, you go down the list until someone does. Then you go again from the 10th after that. So systematic random samples are where there's some logical choice of how you go about choosing those respondents. A stratified sample is selected randomly from members of subgroups. And so these subgroups have different sizes. So for example, if you were trying to do a stratified sample of voters, you might stratify them based on age or generation. So millennials, Generation X, baby boomers, etc. Or you might stratify based on gender. So you want to pick a proportional of men, a proportion of women that is reflective of the entire sampling population of interest. And then finally, you could have area or cluster samples. And this is a sample of the groups themselves in a multi-staged structure. And so again, if we're doing political polling, you might cluster based on neighborhoods and do a sample within each of these particular neighborhoods. And then finally, what normally happens is something that might not have even been discussed in your textbook, but it's called convenience sampling. And honestly, that's probably the most common type of market research, where we are basically sampling whomever in our population who has seen our survey or is eligible to participate in our research, and whoever is convenient is the ones who are responding. Most of my research that's published is based on convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is considered non-random, and that is because not everyone in the population has an equal chance of seeing, so it's convenient to the researcher. It is not qualitative only, so I did want to point that out, that there can be quantitative research that is done based on convenience samples, and I'll show you an example of that. And the purpose is basically to find the people that are most likely to complete your survey, or the people most likely to want to participate in your survey. So for example, if you are looking to do research on golfers, then you would go to a golf club. You wouldn't just do a stratified or even a simple random sample of everybody who's ever played golf. You would go where the golfers are. So this is a convenience sample. A lot of my clients even, it's convenience-based sampling because we're dealing with local clients who are doing research on their own customers or on potential customers or on their competitors' customers. And so it is purposeful, where we find where those individuals are, and where can be in real life or it could be online, right? And we go to them directly. And then what we try to do in non-random sampling is to do some sort of quota. So a certain number of people. I do a lot of this in terms of buckets. So I ask people, and I'll show you an example where I might ask you if you are a coffee drinker or a non-coffee drinker, and I might want 100 coffee drinkers and 100 non-coffee drinkers. And as soon as those 100 respondents answer that question, then no other respondents are able to complete the survey. So there are two types of data: secondary data and primary data. Now, secondary data is information that already exists and is collected for some other purpose. So that census website that I showed you, or the PRISM Claritas, those are secondary data sources. Whereas primary data is information that doesn't exist yet or must be collected for a specific marketing purpose. Apologies for that bottom part right there. So let's talk about secondary data first, because to be honest, secondary data is actually what we look for first in our research methodology. In other words, has someone else already collected the data that we need? So first of all, we have to know what kind of data we need, and then we have to know whether or not it has already been published. It can be internal to the company. In other words, a company sometimes already has this data. They might have a customer database. They might have sales figures. They might have a website that tracks Google Analytics, but nobody's ever looked at the data. They might have management reports from HR, performance reports, things like that. And so sometimes it's really about utilizing and combining sources of information that has already been collected for some reason that the company already owns. Other times, we might look for external secondary data. And those are things like websites, social media sites, newspapers, trade organizations. Those are wonderful opportunities for us when we deal with client data. International organizations, market research reports, or trade association publications. Statista is a website that has tons of great research. Pew Research Organization, that's PEW. That's another media organization that tracks a lot of data. There's social research data sets that track consumer activity. Really valuable resource for secondary data is what's called a reference or a research librarian. Every public library has a research librarian. Most university libraries have several research librarians that specialize in different areas. So at every university that I've ever taught at, we have had a business librarian, a librarian who specializes in knowing where to get secondary data that can be used for business purposes, whether it's in teaching, whether it's for consulting, whether it's for research writing, whether it's for creating marketing or business planning. And so I would encourage you that the first step of your research process, if you are doing marketing research, is to go and find a research librarian. And that research librarian will help you do everything from identifying things like IBIS World, census.gov, the Claritas Prism, Nielsen, EBSCO as a search engine, all of these LexisNexis reporting, all of these online resources that might be available at a public library that can be used to gather insight into whatever it is you're looking for. So just to understand, secondary data, research that's already been collected, either internally by the organization or externally by others, that can then be modified or combined in a different way or examined in a different way to provide marketing insights. And for some marketing research problems, secondary data is enough to answer the question that you have. For some, though, we are going to have to move more towards primary research, because for secondary research, its advantages are that it's unobtrusive, openly available, already vetted, cheaper, and oftentimes faster. And again, those business librarians, they know their stuff, so they often can make my life a lot easier when I'm looking for information. But the disadvantages are, whether or not it's particularly relevant to this specific marketing research question, whether it's out of date, whether data is missing or not, or whether it was collected for a specific purpose that really isn't exactly what this particular research question is. So that's when we move to more primary research. And that primary research can be either quantitative in nature or qualitative in nature. Notice the N in quantitative, and that means that it can be numerically represented in some way. Qualitative is more of understanding why or how a person or a customer feels a particular way or perceives your particular brand. So that research example in perceptual mapping, it can be quantified into those dimensions, or it can be more exploratory in terms of understanding why was Kia perceived as more similar to Ford and Toyota than it is to Buick or BMW and Cadillacs. So let's talk about quantitative research first. Quantitative research often relies on larger numbers of participants with representative samples of the statistical population. The results can be generalized to the larger population as a whole, and it's often captured in numeric data that can then be analyzed in spreadsheets like Excel, SPSS, SAS, or even R. And that statistical analysis takes place to compare the sample respondents to what would be expected from a statistically representative population. And if your sample responds in a significantly different way than would be expected, then your data might suggest a different strategy. So for example, if your male and females respondents are significantly different, then that means that you should have a different strategy for gender. So we want to make sure when we're collecting quantitative data that, first of all, we can make it quantifiable in some way. And then we understand that it does require more than just simple measures of what we call central tendency, so means or medians, because those can be a little bit misleading. So I have this great book called Statistics, How to Lie with Statistics. It's an old cartoon book. And I love it because it really illustrates how numbers can be misleading and questionnaire design can be misleading. In fact, the text talks about how questions can be designed to get you the answer that you want. And that isn't always the best way to do research, which is why oftentimes we go external to a consultant because maybe we are too close to the data or too close to the questions to really form a unbiased design. So quantitative data would ask such as how many people like the new product design, whereas qualitative research would try to understand why do people like this particular design. Similarly, quantitative might ask which features are utilized the most, whereas qualitative research would ask how do you feel about the features. Notice how even in the structure of those questions, we are trying to sort of categorize when we're talking about quantitative questions, and we're trying to generalize or really more understand the foundation of those categories or those emotions or those feelings. So primary research can be observational. So you can watch and record people. It can be interview-based, where you ask the questions and kind of check boxes off on the survey, or they can be online surveys. And so let me just pause here for a second and give you some examples from my own work. So I use a program called Qualtrics. A lot of academic researchers use it, and you can see that I use it quite a bit. My students use it. This is examples from students. So I'm just going to show you an example of preliminary product research. So you might have seen Dipping Dots before, and Dippin' Dots is a product where you flash freeze with liquid nitrogen cream into little ice cream balls. And we worked with the inventor of Dippin' Dots a few years ago because his patent was expiring, and so he sold the company. And when he sold the ice cream company, he decided to take a different route with the process of flash freezing things because he still had that capability. And so what he wanted to do was explore something called espresso dots. So for example, below is a photo of Dippin' Dots espresso dots. And they can be made into hot drinks or cold drinks. And then we asked questions. Please write a few sentences. What is your reaction to the product described? So you see, this is an open-ended response, but this is a numeric response. So these numbers are transferred into values from 1 to 5, from poor to excellent. Higher numbers mean higher quality or higher perceptions or more positive. And then how much would you pay per serving for a proposed 6 ounces of espresso dots? And in this particular question, we actually require them to validate or enter a number. So a minimum characters of 3, maximum of 6. And we give them instructions about that right here. And then check all that apply. You know, is something going to be purchased? Let me put that vertical again. Breakfast time, lunchtime, dinner time, snack time, or other. And here they can answer another. So here would be check all that apply. Whereas circle options are what we call one and only one answer. So these are called radio buttons, and these are called check boxes. Okay, and we move on and on. We get much more information. What are your concerns? Which factors are most important to you? And so on. So this is how I designed the questionnaire in Qualtrics. And then this is what it looked like to customers. Oops. There we go, preview. Hadn't made it small enough for that. And then in the preview button, you can see what it looks like on mobile. I'm going to do something called ignore validation because I have that on just so I can glance through some of these questions. And I'll just show you what it looks like to a respondent. Then we show what it would look like if it was cold. We ask them where they would buy it, how innovative they think it is, et cetera, et cetera. Then we ask how often you drink coffee. Normally, if you see a question like this alone on the page, it means that there will be different questions. We call this branching, different questions on the next page based on your answers to this page. So for example, if you answer never, I think you were kicked out of the rest of the survey. If you answered based on how often you drink coffee, then it went to these questions. It asked you to separate your hot coffee and cold coffee percentages. And then it gave you a matrix of questions about hot coffee, a matrix of questions about cold coffee, where you purchase your coffee at home, or where you make your coffee, or whether you consume it outside of the house. And then these fun ways of kind of pushing things pushing things into different categories. So you can tell that this kind of design is pretty deep. And then we ask the last 2 digits of the year you were born. This gets around different demographic questions, and then a zip code for geographic locations. So on the basis of this, they now have this product in the stores, and it's called 40 Below Joe. real coffee, real caffeine. And it shows that we freeze the and then you decide how to make beverages, whether you are going to eat it as ice cream or drink it, add it, and then stir it. So you'll notice the frappe version of 40 Below Joe is not available yet in stores, mostly because they couldn't figure out the packaging, the appropriate packaging, and they didn't have that, wasn't their primary skill set there. But anyway, you could see how you go from these questionnaires to actual marketing decisions for design and then where to purchase it and where it is now. So very fun example of how we went from true market research using a sample across the U.S. So we used a domestic sample, and then it takes some years to get to the right strategy, the right product names, all of the sort of collateral that goes along with creating a brand from scratch that would not compete with Dippin' Dots. Although if you go here and you go to 40 Below Joe, you'll find out about Kurt Jones and his Dippin' Dot creator and founder, and then how they created 40 Below Joe on the basis of that information. So other types of quantitative surveys like this can be generated through email. Obviously, we can put those questionnaires on our websites. We can send questionnaires. We can print out these questionnaires and send them via the mail. We can ask those questions on a telephone, although in this particular case, it might be hard because you are explaining a product that hadn't existed. So we might choose to do face-to-face interviews or surveys. Think about whether you've ever been intercepted at a mall or at an event to answer questions from someone who has a clipboard. And then consumer panels are very important for marketing research. These are groups of people that agree to be followed over time or to have their purchases tracked and so on, to kind of understand how they make purchase decisions and how to better serve those customers. Qualitative studies can also be interview-based, but they're usually open-ended questions, and the researcher just takes down or literally transcribes the response. Or you could do focus groups, and I've given you an example here. If you literally just YouTube focus group barbecue, you would find that is a great example of how focus groups are conducted. And then there are projective techniques. Here, I think I typed in marketing projective techniques. There's a short 2-minute video that kind of talks about how projective techniques are used in marketing to do sort of word or picture associations. This is important when you're first designing a brand. So what does this name make you feel like? What do you think of when you hear the word 40 Below Joe? Or we could ask for the use of storytelling, analogy, metaphor, or even cultural symbiology to explore how people feel about something. So again, this gets into those types of, those bubbles that came up on the previous couple of slides that said, like, how do you feel about this? Or why do you feel about this? Those are qualitative questions that we would ask. And qualitative research is often much smaller in terms of who you're sampling because you just don't have time to interview everybody. For example, I just did a research project using Amazon's consumer surveys, and I collected 200 surveys in 1 hour. Now, I could never do 200 qualitative interviews in 1 hour. That would be impossible. But what another really fun type of qualitative study is called ethnography. That's where the researcher sort of embeds themselves into a culture or into a group. And now we can do that online as well. So we can embed ourselves into a social media group, let's say, and observe how they react to each other and explore different features of that community by being part of the community. And that would give us some market insights as well. Ultimately, data is information. So it should be timely, it should be accurate, it should be reliable, meaning if I collect it at multiple times, I would get the same data. And it should be valid, meaning that it is representative. So in summary, all research should be conducted ethically. We have to ask ourselves whether we're doing more numeric data collection, which is quantitative, or more the why and hows of things, which is more qualitative. We're going to do secondary research first. Sometimes it will help us to design better primary research because we'll know what has already been answered and what we need more thorough investigation on. And the primary data helps to fill in some of those gaps between the secondary data and the purpose of the marketing research to begin with. We have to concern ourselves with sample size and type of sampling to make sure that our data, the information that is collected, is representative of the population that we are interested in addressing. And finally, we have to choose within the qualitative and quantitative categories how we are going to collect data. I showed you some examples. I hope I piqued your interest. Marketing research, data analytics is the highest paying marketing job, and it is the fastest growing marketing field. So big data we're always collecting data on people, on consumers, but what do we do with that data? That is a marketing research project. And that is being able to translate numbers and information into actionable marketing activities.